The plates were heavy, and her father's glass was already rising. A hush falls over a crowded dining room, the particular hush of a place where a man who owns land and owes money wants to be heard. Candlelight smears gold across every turned face. A woman stands frozen in the doorway, 6 white plates pressing circles into her arms, watching her own future get decided over roast beef before she's set the supper down. Somewhere at the far end of that table, a stranger sets a water pitcher down, without a sound, and leaves before anyone thinks to thank him. There are men who measure a woman the way they measure a heifer, by the pound, by the promise of what she might yield. And there are debts written not in a banker's ledger, but into the terms of a marriage nobody bothered to ask her about. $4,200. That was the price of her whole life. She just didn't know it yet. The plates were heavy. That was the first thing Opal Kingston noticed. Not the noise of the dining room, already climbing towards something dangerous. Not her father's voice, big and warm, and halfway to a toast, before she'd even crossed the threshold. Just the weight of 6 stacked plates pressing white circles into her forearms, because the kitchen girl had gone home sick that afternoon, and somebody had to carry supper in, and tonight, of every night this house had ever hosted, that somebody was her. She stood in the doorway. She did not walk through it. Because her father's glass was already rising. Because the room had already gone still the way rooms go still, when a man who owns land and owes money wants to be listened to. "Friends," Elias Kingston said, and his voice filled every corner of that dining room the way it filled every corner of every room he had ever stood in, from church pews to cattle auctions. "Neighbors. Family. I've got an announcement." Opal's arms ached under the plates. She told herself to walk in, set the table, disappear the way she always disappeared at moments built for men, and their toasts, and their handshakes, moments that existed on a plane just slightly above her, like whether she wasn't invited to have an opinion on. Except she didn't move. Because something in her father's face stopped her. Pride. That was what it was. Pride with an edge underneath it, sharp as a knife hidden inside a folded napkin, the kind you don't feel until you've already cut yourself reaching for the bread. "My daughter," Elias said, and lifted his glass another inch, "will be married by spring." The plates did not fall. Opal made sure of that. She held them. She held her breath too, until it burned behind her ribs, until the room tilted just slightly, candlelight smearing gold across every face turned toward her father, every face except one, at the far end of the table, where the only son of the county's only banker sat, with a smile already forming, patient, practiced, arriving a half-second before the words that produced it. Bennett Corbin. Wearing a suit too fine for a ranch supper, cut close through the shoulders, the kind of coat a man wears when he already knows, walking through the door, exactly how the evening ends. "Bennett's father and I have spoken twice this month," Elias went on, and his hand found the back of a chair, steadying himself against something Opal couldn't name yet. "We'll announce it proper at the engagement party next week. Spring sale ought to put us in good shape for a wedding after." Bennett set his glass down. Slow. Deliberate. A man closing a deal he had already closed twice inside his own head, once for himself, and once, more thoroughly, for his father. He did not look at Opal. He looked at her father. Held his eyes the particular way men hold eyes, when they are sealing something, with more weight in it than affection, a cattle sale, a mortgage, a marriage, all of them, apparently, negotiated with the same steady, businesslike gaze. Then, only then, did he turn toward her, and even that turn felt performed, as though he'd remembered, halfway through the room going quiet, that there was a woman somewhere attached to this arrangement, and she probably ought to be looked at. His eyes moved over her. Not into her face first. Over her. The plates in her arms. The soft weight of her, the weight she had spent a lifetime being told, in small voices, and smaller compliments, to apologize for. She had grown up in a county that measured a woman the way it measured a heifer, by the pound, and by the promise of what she might yield, and she had learned early, which men did the measuring openly, and which men did it quietly, behind good manners, the way Bennett was doing it now. Bennett's smile didn't waver. But something behind it did the arithmetic anyway. Opal watched him do it. Watched him land, in half a second, on some private accounting of what he was getting, and what he'd have to overlook to get it, and watched him decide, with the same ease he'd decide on a horse, or a parcel of grazing land, that the overlooking was worth the getting. "You'll want for nothing, Opal," he said. Warm voice. Banker's voice. The kind that sounds generous, and costs you everything you own by the end of the sentence. "Once we're married, you won't need to trouble yourself with the ledgers anymore. Or the cattle counts. Or any of it. Any of it." 2 words. That was all it took to erase 11 years of columns she'd balanced by lamplight at that same kitchen table, 11 years of catching errors the hired men made, without once being credited for the catching, of knowing which pasture flooded first in a wet spring, and which bull sired the calves, that came easiest, of understanding this ranch down in her bones the way her father understood Scripture, badly, imperfectly, but with a conviction nothing on earth could talk him out of. Any of it. She set the plates down at the sideboard. Carefully. Because her hands had started to shake, and she would rather break every dish in the house on the floor than let this room see her hands shake, over a man like Bennett Corbin. At the far end of the room, near the kitchen door, a man she didn't recognize stood holding a water pitcher. Tall. Sun-marked across the forearms, the kind of brown that doesn't wash off even in the dead of winter. Somewhere near 30, though it was hard to say exactly. Some men wear their years in the set of their shoulders instead of the lines of their face, and this one had clearly been carrying something heavier than his age for longer than his age would suggest. He'd been called in, from the barn, she guessed, the way hired hands sometimes were on nights the kitchen underestimated its guest list, the way her father liked to fill a room past its comfortable capacity whenever he had good news to perform. The man did not smile. He did not join the small ripple of congratulations moving down the table, the murmured "well now," and "about time," and fine match," that particular music of a county agreeing with itself about something it had no actual stake in. He set the pitcher down. No sound. No clatter. The kind of quiet that takes years of practice, the kind of quiet a man learns when he's spent enough of his life being told to make himself small in rooms he wasn't born welcome in. And then he was gone. Through the kitchen door. Before anyone noticed he had left at all. Before anyone but Opal. She stood there a moment longer, one hand still flat against the cool wood of the sideboard, and thought, he understood. Whatever had just happened to her, in front of God, and neighbors and a man who'd looked at her like a line item in a ledger he hadn't yet decided whether to approve, that stranger with the pitcher had understood it whole, in the half-second, before he turned away, and disappeared back, into the dark, where he apparently believed he belonged. Nobody else in that room had. Not her father, drunk on his own relief. Not Bennett, already composing the sentence he'd used to describe this evening to his father later. Not even, if she was honest with herself, her own sister, who loved her fiercely, but had never once had to sit through a room deciding her future for her without asking. Only the stranger with the pitcher. She excused herself before dessert. Nobody stopped her. Her father had already moved on to bloodlines and interest rates, deep in conversation with Bennett's father, a stout gray man named Harlan Corbin, who owned the only bank within 3 counties, and Opal strongly suspected half the debts sitting quietly inside it too, tucked into private ledgers nobody but him was ever permitted to read in full. Her sister June caught her eye across the table. One look, quick and sharp, that said everything June didn't dare say out loud at that table with their father's pride still ringing in the rafters. "I saw that. I saw all of it, and I am furious on your behalf." Opal walked out into the cold. The porch boards creaked under her the way they always did, familiar as breathing, familiar as the particular ache in her lower back, from carrying plates, and the particular ache higher up, near her heart, from carrying everything else. Behind her, laughter rolled out, through the windows, muffled and gold-lit, a party already congratulating itself on a marriage that had never once asked her opinion of it. She didn't go toward the house's east wing, where her own small room waited, with its narrow bed, and its window, that stuck in wet weather. She went toward the barn. She didn't decide to. Her feet simply carried her there, the way water finds the low ground, without ever needing to be told which way is down. Lamplight spilled out, from the open barn door, warm against the blue dark of the yard, and inside, the stranger with the pitcher was crouched at a mare's foreleg, running his thumb along the swell of a joint, murmuring something too low for her to catch the words of, only the tone, steady, unhurried, the tone of a man who has learned that most creatures, human and otherwise, calm faster when you stop trying to rush them toward calm. He looked up, when her boots hit the packed dirt. Then he looked back down. Bent to the mare again. "Ma'am," he said. Not unfriendly. Just careful. A man measuring the size of a conversation, before he agreed to step inside it, the way you test the ice on a pond, before trusting your full weight to it. She stayed near the stall door. Arms wrapped tight against the cold, against everything. "You were in the dining room," she said. "You didn't stay for the toast." He didn't answer right away. His hand kept moving, over the mare's leg, steady, unhurried, like her question was a task he needed to finish this other task, before he could properly hold. Then he straightened. Looked at her. Full on this time. Nothing performed in it. Nothing measuring. Nothing doing arithmetic on the shape of her the way Bennett's eyes had, not 30 minutes earlier, in a room 20 yards away, that already felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. "Ma'am," he said, "I won't congratulate you on a thing you didn't choose." Something in her chest clenched tight since the moment her father raised that glass, clenched tight. If she let herself be honest, for longer than that, came loose. Not all the way. Just enough to breathe around, the way a knot loosens just enough to let a rope move again, without ever fully untying itself. She held out her hand, into the lantern light between them. "I don't believe I caught your name." He wiped his palm once against his trousers, before he took it. His grip was rough. Careful anyway, the particular carefulness of a man who has learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how much strength a hand can carry, and exactly how little of it he ought to use on a woman he's just met. "Wade Calloway," he said. "The foreman hired me on 3 weeks back. Calving and fence work, mostly, whatever else needs doing." Then he was bent, over the mare's leg again, thumb pressing at the swelling, not looking up. Not asking her to explain herself. Not asking her to stay. Somehow that was the thing that let her breathe all the way. She stood there a minute longer, watching him work, watching the lantern light catch the gray already threading early, through his dark hair at the temples, more than his age should have allowed. Whatever had put it there, she thought, wasn't likely a gentle story. "Good night, Mr. Calloway," she said finally. "Good night, Miss Kingston." He didn't look up. But something in his voice had gentled, just slightly, around her name. She walked back to the house slower than she'd walked away from it, the cold air doing what cold air always did, clearing her head just enough to let the whole terrible shape of the evening settle properly into place. She was engaged. To a man who thought her ledgers were a hobby he'd graciously permit her to abandon. Because of a debt she didn't yet know the size of, contracted by a father who loved her the way he loved most things, fiercely, and without ever once asking what the thing itself might want. She did not sleep well that night. But she slept, eventually, with the memory of a stranger's steady hands, and the particular relief of 6 words. "I won't congratulate you on a thing you didn't choose." Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. By the second week of the engagement, Opal had found more reasons to be at the working end of the ranch than the house could reasonably hold against her. She told her father it was to keep busy, before the wedding. Which was true, as far as it went, the way most convenient truths are true, as far as they go, and no further. What she didn't tell him what she barely let herself think in the full honesty of daylight, was that Wade Calloway had corrected her tallies exactly once, 3 days after they met, standing at the north fence, with his hat pushed back, and his eyes on her column of numbers instead of on her. "Foreman's got 40 head here," he'd said. "I make it 36. Nobody had ever done that before." Checked her work like it deserved checking. Like it might, against the general county consensus on the matter, actually be right. Because that was the thing about being a big girl in a small county. People either looked past your numbers straight to your body, weighing you before they'd ever bother weighing your arithmetic, or they didn't look at you long enough to notice you had numbers at all, filed away somewhere behind the parts of you they'd already decided mattered more. Her father fell into the second category. He loved her, she never doubted that, not once, not even on the worst of these nights. But he loved her the way a man loves a good dog, fondly, absently, without ever once wondering what the dog might think about anything, without ever imagining the dog might have opinions worth soliciting on its own future. Bennett fell into the first category. Worse than most, dressed up nicer than most. He rode out, that week, to walk the porch, with her, hat under his arm, talking about curtains. About a house in town near his father's bank, 3 bedrooms and a parlor for entertaining. He set his hand briefly, over hers on the porch rail, more claim than affection, the particular way a man sets his hand on a fence post he's already decided belongs to him. "The wedding date will suit the bank's spring calendar better than your father's planting season," he said. Like that settled something. Like her own calendar, her own preferences, had never once entered into the conversation at all. She'd been carrying a ledger under her arm when he arrived. He never once asked what was in it. She slipped her hand free, before he noticed, and said the north fence needed her that afternoon. He didn't offer to come. She held the ledger out to Wade, over the fence rail the next morning, the cold sharp enough to fog both their breath, into small white clouds, that dissolved almost, as soon as they formed. "Your count's off on the north pasture," she said. "Foreman's got 40 head. I make it 36. Wade took the ledger. Studied her figures a long moment, his brow drawn down in genuine consideration rather than polite performance. Then he swung up onto his horse, without a word. "Let's see which of us is wrong." They found 36. He didn't praise her like she'd performed a trick, the way people sometimes did, when a large woman proved capable of something they hadn't expected of her, as though competence in someone her size was a novelty act rather than a plain fact of a life spent working. He handed the ledger back like the numbers had belonged to her all along, like there had never been a real question of whether they might not. "You ought to be running these books," he said, "instead of checking another man's arithmetic." Then he rode on to the next fence line, leaving her standing there in the cold, with the compliment landing harder in her chest than anything Bennett Corbin had managed in a full month of courting. She started finding him at the calving shed most mornings after that. Not by arrangement. Never by arrangement, not in those early weeks, just because the work was there, and she went where the work was, the way she always had, long before anyone in that county had thought to call it courtship instead of simple necessity. He handed her a lantern when she needed one. Asked her opinion on a breech calf's positioning like her answer might genuinely matter more than the veterinarian's would, 3 counties over, and a full day's ride away. One gray dawn, wrist deep in the business of turning a calf inside a straining heifer, he glanced up at her, without stopping his hands. "You've done this before." She braced her boot against the stall rail, holding the calf's hind legs steady in the cold. "Since I was 12. My father used to say I had better hands for it than any man he'd hired. And now? Now I got old enough to marry off." He stopped saying it. Wade didn't look up from the calf. But something in his jaw tightened, just slightly, the way a man's jaw tightens when he's biting down on a thing he'd like to say, and doesn't yet have the standing to say it. "Doesn't make it less true," was all he offered. She noticed things about him after that. Small things. The kind of things you only notice about a person once you've started, without ever quite deciding to, cataloging them in some private ledger of your own. He worked the same at 3 in the morning, with no witness but her, as he did at noon, with the whole crew watching. Kindness could be performed for an audience. She had watched Bennett perform his 100 times over the years. A coin for a beggar, with 3 men standing near enough to see it, a gentle word to a horse only, when someone stood by to admire the gentleness. Wade's kindness had no audience most of the time. Which was, she was slowly starting to understand, the only kind of kindness worth trusting, with anything real. He noticed things about her, too. That she took her coffee black, no sugar, no cream, the way her mother had before her. That she wrote her tallies left-handed, and always smudged the ink along the side of her palm, a faint gray shadow she carried, through most days like a bruise, that never quite healed, and never quite needed to. He never once mentioned her weight. Not as a joke, the way the boys in town had joked, when she was younger, cruelty dressed up as teasing. Not as a compliment either, dressed up to sound generous. You carry it well, or there's more of you to love, the particular kind of thing men said, when they believed themselves to be doing her a favor. He just didn't account for it. The way you don't account for the color of a man's eyes, when you're asking him to help you pull a calf at 3 in the morning. It simply wasn't part of whatever arithmetic he was running, wasn't a factor he weighed, before deciding what her opinion was worth, or how hard he'd work to earn her respect. Which was, in its own quiet way, the loudest thing anyone had ever said to her in her whole life. One night, the calf came breech and stubborn, and by the time it was down, and breathing on the straw, both of them were filthy to the elbow, and past caring, who might see them that way. Wade sat back against the stall wall, spent. Opal sat beside him, without thinking twice about the distance between them, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, close enough that the lantern light caught both their faces at once, gilding the exhaustion and the relief in equal measure. She wiped her hands on a length of burlap. Not quite joking. Bennett would faint dead away in here. Bennett's never had reason to learn otherwise. Wade didn't move his arm from where it rested near hers. Man like that only knows what a ranch is worth on paper. She turned her head toward him. And you? He got to his feet before he answered. Brushed straw from his knees, taking his time about it, the way a man takes his time, when the honest answer is going to cost him something he's not sure he's ready to give up yet. I know what it costs, he said. To keep one standing? He reached a hand down to help her up. Let go of it the moment she had her balance, careful, deliberate, in a way that told her exactly how carefully he was choosing not to hold on any longer than the moment strictly required. She stood there a moment in the lantern light, catching her breath, watching him gather the burlap, and the lantern, and every available excuse to keep his hands occupied with something other than her. Because that was the thing about Wade Calloway, she was starting to understand. He never reached for more than the moment offered him, not once, not even when the moment seemed to be offering quite a bit. Which made her wonder, walking back to the house alone under a sky gone hard, and bright with stars, exactly what a moment would have to offer, before he'd finally let himself reach at all, and whether she'd be brave enough, when that moment finally arrived, to offer it to him first. She found the letter 3 days later. By accident. That was the truth of it, however guilty it made her feel afterward. She hadn't gone looking for trouble. She'd only gone into her father's study to fetch the seed catalog he'd asked her for, and the letter was sitting there on the corner of his desk, half buried under a stack of receipts, the bank's letterhead facing up like it wanted, in some small treacherous way, to be found. Corbin County Bank and Trust. She shouldn't have read it. She told herself that even as her eyes were already moving down the page, because some part of her, the part that had balanced this ranch's books since she was 16 years old, and never once been thanked for it in a way that counted, already knew, in her gut, before she'd read a single sentence, that this letter explained something important, something nobody had trusted her enough to say to her face. It did. Dear Mr. Kingston. Per our conversation of the 14th, this letter confirms the current balance owed against the North and East parcels, totaling $4,200, with interest accruing at the rate previously discussed. As mentioned, given the family arrangement now under discussion, my father is prepared to extend the note through the spring, without penalty, contingent upon the engagement proceeding as planned. Should circumstances change, the bank will require the balance in full by the first of the year. Yours B. Corbin. Opal read it twice. Then a third time, because the second reading hadn't managed to make it mean anything different. $4,200. She knew this ranch's numbers better than any living soul, including her father, and she had never once seen that figure in his books. Never seen it in the ledgers she kept, the ones he trusted her to balance, because he trusted arithmetic more than he trusted his own memory for anything that wasn't cattle. He had kept this apart from her. Hidden it in some private column she'd never once been shown, some drawer of his own life he'd never once opened for her inspection, though she'd opened every other drawer of this ranch 1,000 times, over on his behalf. Her hands were shaking now. Not from cold. Contingent upon the engagement proceeding as planned. So that was the shape of it, laid bare in a banker's careful, unhurried hand. Not a match born of two families, who admired each other. Not even, really, a match born of ambition, the way she'd assumed all along, her father chasing a bank's respectability the way he chased good bloodlines in a bull, for pride rather than profit. It was a debt. Plain as that. A debt with her name written into the terms of it, though her name appeared nowhere on the page itself, as if the terms didn't require her actual consent, so much as her physical presence at the altar on the appointed day. She set the letter down exactly where she'd found it. Straight in the corner of the receipt stack, until it looked, as best she could manage, with hands that wouldn't fully stop trembling, like no one had touched it at all. Then she went and found the seed catalog, and carried it back to her father, and said nothing. Because what was there to say? Because saying it out loud would mean admitting she'd seen it. Because seeing it meant she now had to decide, alone and in secret, what to do, with a truth nobody in this house had trusted her enough to hand over honestly. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark doing the only thing she truly knew how to do, with a number that large and that ugly. She ran it, over and over, against every column of this ranch's income she could hold in her head. Cattle sales, projected against last year's prices. Feed costs, already climbing with the season. The wet spring 3 years back, that had cost them 1/5 of the herd, and set the whole operation back further than her father had ever admitted out loud. She turned the debt over like a stone pulled from a creek bed, looking for the crack in it, the place where it might come apart, into something survivable, something that didn't require her whole future as collateral. She didn't find one. Not that night. What she found instead, somewhere past midnight, staring at the ceiling, with her jaw aching, from being clenched so long, was something colder and clearer than fear. This is why he wants me married so badly. Not for love. Not even for pride, not really, not underneath it. For $4,200, and a bank willing to forgive it, so long as I say yes at the altar on the appointed day, and don't cause any inconvenient trouble beforehand. She thought of Bennett's hand on the porch rail. More claim than affection. She thought of Wade's hand, letting go of hers the second she had her balance. Two men. Two entirely different ways of touching a woman, who wasn't yet theirs. Only one of them had ever once asked what she thought about anything at all. She didn't tell her father what she'd read. Not yet. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, though some more honest part of her understood she was waiting for something else entirely. For proof, maybe, that the number wasn't as large as it looked on paper, or that her father had some other plan beyond marrying her off to make the whole ugly business disappear. Neither proof arrived. What arrived instead, 10 days later, was a conversation in the barn that started as nothing and ended as something she would carry the rest of her life. Wade was mending a bridle by lantern light when she found him, needle and wax thread moving through leather with the same patience he brought to everything he touched. She sat on an overturned bucket a few feet off, close enough to talk, far enough to pretend, for her own sake more than his, that she hadn't come looking for him on purpose. "You ever think about it?" she said. "Owning land yourself?" His hands didn't stop moving. But something in his shoulders went very still, the particular stillness of a man walking toward a memory he'd rather not visit in company, even good company. "Used to," he said. "Used to. My family had a place. West of here. Not big. Good water, though. Good bottom land." He pulled the thread through, slow and even, the rhythm of his hands never once breaking pace, with the rhythm of the story. "I was 16, when the bank called the note." Opal went quiet. Something cold moving through her stomach, some instinct arriving a half-second ahead of the actual words. "Which bank?" she said. Those she already knew. Those she'd known, somehow, from the second stillness first crossed his shoulders. Wade looked up at her then. Held her eyes the way he never quite let himself do, most days, like he'd decided the honest answer was owed to her whether or not it cost him something to give. "Corbin's," he said. The word landed in the lantern light between them, and simply sat there, either of them reaching to pick it up right away, both of them letting its full weight settle, before either could speak around it. "They gave my father 60 days, Wade went on, voice level, the way a man's voice goes level, when he's told a story enough times to wear the sharpest edges smooth, even if the wearing never once reached all the way down to the center of it. 60 days to raise a note that had taken him 11 years to fall behind on. He couldn't do it. Nobody could have done it. I don't believe they ever wanted him to. Why not? Because the land was worth more than the note by then. Water rights alone. Old man Corbin, Harlan's father, he wasn't in the business of forgiving debts he could collect on instead. Forgiveness doesn't build a bank the size of his. Opal sat very still on the bucket. Her mind unbidden, doing the arithmetic it always did, laying Wade's story alongside the letter she'd read in her father's study, watching the two sums slide together into a single, ugly total. Contingent upon the engagement proceeding as planned. They gave my father 60 days. Same bank. Same family. 2 different ranches, a decade apart, both of them ground down slow and patient under the same unhurried hand. You didn't come here by accident, she said. Quiet. Not an accusation, only an arrival. Arriving, finally, out loud, at something she'd half suspected, since the very night of the toast, since the way he'd set the pitcher down, without a sound, and vanished before anyone had thought to thank him for it. Wade's hands finally stopped on the bridle. No, ma'am, he said. I didn't. Then why? He was quiet a long moment. Long enough that she heard the mare shift in her stall, the wind working at a loose board somewhere overhead, the whole barn breathing slow and patient around the silence he was standing inside of. Heard talk 3 counties over that Elias Kingston needed hands for calving season. He said finally. Heard, same week, that Harlan Corbin's boy was courting his daughter. His jaw worked once tight. Wasn't hard to put together what kind of courting that was likely to turn out to be, given what I already knew about that family and how they conducted their business. So you came to watch? I came, he said, because I know exactly what that bank does to a family it's decided to own. And I wasn't about to let it happen twice in one lifetime, without at least being close enough to see it plain, whatever good that seeing might actually do. The honesty of it should have frightened her. Some part of her understood that clearly enough, a stranger, drawn to her father's ranch by nothing warmer than old grief, and a hard-earned suspicion of the Corbin name, watching her family's ruin unfold the way a man watches whether he already knows is coming. It should have felt like being watched, from a distance, like being one more piece of collateral inside somebody else's long, slow, private reckoning. It didn't feel like that. Not sitting there in the lantern light, watching him hold her eyes, without once looking away, from the cost of what he just admitted out loud, for the first time, to anyone. It felt like being the first true thing anyone in this whole county had said to her in months, maybe years. And now, she said, now that you're close enough to see it plain. Wade set the bridle down across his knee. Looked at it instead of her, for the first time since he'd started talking at all. "No," he said. "It's grown more complicated than I planned on when I rode in here." He didn't say why. He didn't have to. The word hung there between them exactly the way his hand had hung in the air, after he'd let go of hers, weeks back, careful not to reach any further than the moment strictly allowed him to reach. Opal stood. Smoothed her skirt, though there was nothing on it to smooth, the gesture only a way of occupying hands that had nowhere else to go. Her heart was going hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and she told herself, walking back toward the house under a sky gone black and close with cloud, that it was only the cold making her chest feel that way. Only the wind, nothing more. She didn't believe herself even a little. Her father noticed the pattern, before she did, or before she'd admit to it herself, at least, which amounted to nearly the same thing most days. He watched from the porch some evenings, arms crossed over his chest, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he already suspected he wasn't going to like the answer to. He had never once been a man who watched cattle he trusted. He watched the ones he wasn't sure of yet, the skittish ones, the ones with a wild eye, that hadn't decided whether they'd break gentle, or break a fence rail trying not to. He was starting, Opal understood with a small cold drop in her stomach, to watch Wade Calloway the very same way. It came to a head on a gray Tuesday, cold enough that her breath hung visible in front of her the whole walk to the barn. "You've taken a shine to the new hand," her father said. No preamble at all. He'd never once been a man for preamble in his life. Opal kept her eyes on the ledger open across her knees, the columns of feed costs she'd been checking since before he'd walked out onto the porch. "I've taken a shine to correct arithmetic," she said. "He happens to be the only man on this place who checks his own numbers instead of guessing at them and hoping for the best." Opal. She looked up then. Met his eyes steady as she could manage, though her pulse was going hard enough that she worried, absurdly, he might somehow hear it from where he stood. "I know what you saw at the calving shed," he said. "Boyd told me. Said the two of you were out there past midnight most nights this month. Pulling calves, Pa. That's the job you hired him for in the first place." "Don't play me for a fool, girl." "Not unkind, exactly. Just tired. Tired in the particular way of a man carrying a debt he hadn't yet told his own daughter about, watching that same daughter drift, slow and steady, toward the one man in the whole county least likely to be able to help him solve it. You're engaged. You understand what that means, don't you? What it costs this family, if it doesn't hold." "I know exactly what it costs," she wanted to say. $4,200, and a bank willing to forgive it, so long as I say yes at the altar. The words sat right there behind her teeth, sharp enough to cut clean on the way out, if she let them. She didn't say them. Not yet. Some instinct, older than her anger, told her the moment wasn't right for it, that a truth that size thrown carelessly across a porch on a gray Tuesday morning would do more damage loose than held a while longer. "I understand," she said instead. Quiet. Careful. "I understand a good deal better than you think I do, Pa." Something in his face flickered at that, surprise maybe, or the very beginning of a question he didn't quite know how to shape into words yet. He studied her a long moment, the way he might study a fence line he suspected was about to come down in a storm he could feel building, but couldn't yet properly name. Then he turned. Walked back into the house, without another word passing between them. Opal sat alone on the porch along, while after, ledger closed across her knees, watching the gray sky press down over the ranch like something patient, waiting to break. Because it was coming. She could feel it the way she felt weather 2 days out, a pressure gathering somewhere just past the horizon, unhurried and certain, taking its own time, before it finally arrived to change everything. Whatever was coming, she understood in her bones, was going to cost somebody a great deal more than money. The days that followed moved the way days move, before a storm, too quiet, too still, every ordinary thing carrying a faint electric charge that hadn't been there a week before. Bennett rode out twice that week. Once to walk the pasture fence, with her father, deep in conversation about spring calving numbers and bank rates, their voices low and businesslike in a way that made Opal's stomach turn every time she caught a fragment of it drifting across the yard on the wind. Once to sit, with her on the porch, hat in his lap, talking about the house in town, 3 bedrooms, he told her, a parlor big enough for entertaining his father's associates, a kitchen his mother had already started furnishing, with linens Opal had never once been consulted about. He never once asked if she wanted a kitchen his mother had furnished for her. "You've gone quiet on me, Opal," he said midway through describing the wallpaper his mother favored for the front hall. "Something troubling you?" $4,200, she thought. "And a bank that apparently owns my father's silence outright, along with a good deal else besides." "Just tired," she said instead. "Calving season." Bennett's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "You spend an awful lot of time out at that calving shed for a woman who's set to marry into town come spring." The words landed soft, almost teasing. But underneath them, Opal heard the same careful arithmetic she'd watched him perform the night of the toast. A man weighing what he was willing to overlook against what he expected to own outright once the ring finally sat on her finger for good. "Somebody's got to keep the books straight," she said. "Foreman can't do sums to save his own life, bless him. You won't need to trouble yourself with any of that once we're married." 3rd time he'd said it. She had started, without meaning to, keeping count. "I've told you that already, more than once." "You have. Doesn't sit well with you." "I can see plainly that it doesn't." For one wild, reckless second, she considered telling him everything. Considered laying the whole ugly truth of the letter out on the porch rail between them, the $4,200, the contingency, the 60 days his own family had once given a man named Calloway to raise a debt 11 years in the making. She didn't. Some cold, careful part of her understood that Bennett Corbin already knew every figure in that letter better than she ever could. He had written it. His own hand, right there at the bottom of the page. "Yours B. Corbin." He wasn't a bystander to this arrangement at all. He was its architect, dressed up handsomely in a fine coat and good manners, smiling at her across a porch rail like a man who had never once had to raise his voice to get exactly what he wanted from the world. "I'll manage," she said instead. Flat. Final, or as final as she could make it sound. Bennett studied her a moment. Something behind his eyes recalculating, the way it always seemed to, when she didn't answer him the way he'd expected her to. "You will," he agreed. "You'll have to, one way or another." He said it like a promise. It landed in her chest, like a plain and simple threat. That night, unable to sleep, Opal walked out past the house to the calving shed, telling herself she only meant to check on a heifer close to term. She found Wade there instead, sitting on an overturned crate near the lantern, mending a length of rope, with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything he touched, as though patience were simply the currency he'd decided to spend his whole life in. He looked up when she came in. Didn't smile, exactly. But something eased in his shoulders, the particular loosening of a man who'd been braced, without fully realizing it, for a different and less welcome kind of company. "Couldn't sleep either," she said. Not quite a question. "Never sleep much, this time of year." He nodded to the crate beside him. She sat. "Heifers keep a man honest about his rest, whether he likes it or not." They sat a while in silence, the good kind, the kind that didn't need filling with words for its own sake. Somewhere in the dark a calf bawled once, then settled back into quiet. The lantern hissed low and steady between them. "I told Bennett I'd manage," she said finally. Not entirely sure why she was telling him this, not entirely sure, really, why she'd walked all the way out here at midnight instead of lying awake in her own bed like a sensible woman, with better sense than to go looking for trouble in a barn after dark. About the wedding. The house in town. All of it, the whole arrangement. Wade's hands stilled on the rope. "And will you manage?" She considered the question longer than it probably deserved a considered answer. I don't rightly know anymore. I used to think I would. Used to think I'd find some way to make it bearable, being married to a man who thinks my numbers are a hobby he'll graciously let me set down once he owns me proper and legal. That's not managing, Wade said quietly. That's surviving. There's a difference, whatever the word sounds like on the surface. Is there truly a difference? There's all the difference in the world. He set the rope down across his knee. Looked at her, really looked, the way he had, that very first night in the barn, nothing performed in it, nothing weighing her for what she was worth on paper the way half this county seemed content to do. Surviving is what you do to a thing you can't change. Managing is what you tell yourself you're doing, so the surviving doesn't feel quite so much like giving up on your own life. Opal's throat went tight. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, ink-stained along the side of the left palm the way they always were, the way they'd been, since she was 16 years old, and first trusted, with a ledger nobody else in the house wanted the trouble of keeping straight. You make it sound simple, she said. Choosing not to survive something. Didn't say it was simple. His voice had gone rougher now, low, like something in him was working hard to stay level under a weight he wasn't fully accustomed to carrying out loud. Said it was different. There's a world of difference between a woman who endures her own life and one who's actually living it. I've watched you long enough now to know which one you were, before all this happened to you. He nodded toward the house, toward the whole tangled weight of engagement, and debt and bank letters sitting behind her in the dark, unspoken but plainly understood between them now. I'd hate to watch you talk yourself into becoming the other kind of woman, Opal. Genuinely, I would. She looked up at him. The lantern light caught the line of his jaw, the careful stillness he always seemed to be holding himself inside of, like a man standing very still at the edge of something he wasn't entirely sure he had earned the right to step toward yet. Why do you care? She said. Quiet. Almost daring him, in that moment, to answer her honestly and completely. He didn't look away this time. Because I watched a bank take everything my family ever had, he said, and tell themselves the whole, while it was simply business, nothing personal in it at all. I know exactly what that looks like, dressed up nice and reasonable. I know precisely what it costs a person, being managed instead of properly asked. His jaw worked once tight. I'd rather see you asked, Opal. Even if it's not by me doing the asking in the end. The even if it's not by me landed harder than anything else he'd said, that whole long winter. Sat there in the space between them, honest and aching, and entirely, painfully unclaimed by either of them. She wanted, badly, to reach across that space and close it for good. To tell him it could be him, that she'd rather be asked by a man who checked her arithmetic, without being told to, and let go of her hand the second she had her balance than spend a whole lifetime being managed by a man who never once asked what she wanted from her own kitchen wallpaper. She didn't. Because some things said too early curdle before they've had the proper chance to grow into anything worth keeping. Because her father was still watching, from the porch some evenings, arms crossed, doing his own quiet and separate arithmetic. Because there was a debt of $4,200 sitting squarely between her and every single choice she had once believed herself free to make on her own account. Good night, Wade, she said instead, standing, smoothing her skirt over hands that weren't quite steady. He nodded. Picked the rope back up. Good night, Miss Kingston. Miss Kingston. Formal again, careful again, the way he always retreated into formality the instant something real had passed between them, like a man closing a gate behind a horse he'd just let run a good deal further than he'd originally planned to allow. She walked back to the house alone, under a sky gone hard, and bright with cold stars, her heart going harder than the mere walk alone could reasonably account for. The engagement party was 7 days off now. Close enough that Opal could feel it approaching the way she felt weather 2 days out, a pressure gathering at the edge of everything. Her father had taken to walking the property most evenings, alone, hat pulled low, the particular walk of a man circling a problem he hadn't yet found the true shape of. Opal watched him, from the kitchen window one evening, her hands still damp, from washing up, and felt something in her chest twist tight, with an emotion she couldn't quite name, not entirely pity, not entirely anger, something tangled up uncomfortably between the two. Because she understood him now, or understood him better than she had a month before. Understood the debt sitting behind every decision he'd made this whole year, understood the particular desperation of a man watching the only real inheritance he had left to leave his daughters slip slowly toward a bank that had already proven, once, exactly how patient, and exactly how merciless it was capable of being, when it decided to be. She didn't excuse him for any of it. But she understood. June found her, that same evening, drying dishes at the counter, and set the towel down, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who'd been waiting the better part of a whole day for the right moment to finally say something important. "You've been different," June said. "Since the toast." Opal kept her eyes on the plate in her hands. "Everyone's different, getting engaged." "That's not what I mean, and you know it perfectly well." June leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her voice gone low and careful. "You look like yourself again, Opal. Out at that calving shed. First time in months you've looked like yourself, if I'm honest with you." Opal's hands stilled on the plate. "And in this kitchen," June went on, gentler now. "Getting ready to marry a man who's never once asked to see your ledgers. You don't look like yourself at all in here. You look like somebody being folded up small enough, on purpose, to fit into a life that was never built to hold the whole of you." The words landed harder than June probably meant them to. Or maybe exactly as hard as she meant them to land. June had never once, in her whole life, been a woman for gentleness dressed up as anything other than the truth. "What am I supposed to do?" Opal said. Quiet. Almost pleading, though she hated how much it sounded that way, hated the particular helplessness in her own voice. "Pa's got debts, June. Debts I wasn't even supposed to know about, that he never once trusted me enough to tell me himself. This marriage isn't just about whether I'm happy or not. It's about whether we keep this ranch at all, whether you and I have anywhere to stand come next winter." June's face went very still. What debts? Opal hadn't meant to say it, not yet, not this way. The words had slipped loose, before she'd properly decided to let them go, the way true things sometimes do, when they've been held too long, and too tight inside a person. She set the plate down. Told June everything, the letter, the exact figure, the contingency written into it in Bennett Corbin's own careful hand. June listened without interrupting once, her arms still crossed, her jaw going tighter, with every single sentence. "He never told us," she said, when Opal finally finished. "Not a question. A verdict plain and complete. No. He let us think this whole business was about, what? Ambition. A good match, nothing more complicated than that. Not," June's voice cracked, just slightly on the word, "not us being sold outright to cover a debt he was too proud to ever admit he'd let get that far out of hand." "June. No, I heard you plain." June pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a moment, breathing hard through her nose. "I heard every word of it." She dropped her hand, looked at Opal, with something fierce and frightened both moving across her face at the very same time. "You can't marry him, Opal. Not for this reason. Not simply to cover Pa's mistake for him." "And if the ranch goes under instead? What happens to you then, June? To Pa in his old age, with nothing left to show for a whole lifetime of work? I've done that arithmetic too, you understand. I've run it 100 separate times since I first read that letter, and every single time it comes out exactly the same. There's no version of saying no that doesn't cost this family something enormous in the end. There's no version of saying yes that doesn't cost you everything," June said. Quiet now. Steady in a way that cut deeper than shouting ever could have. "That's the whole difference, Opal. You keep doing the sums on what it costs everyone else in this family. You never once run the numbers on what it costs you personally, at the center of it." Opal had no answer ready for that. Stood there in the kitchen, dish towel forgotten entirely in her hands, and felt the truth of it settle over her like cold water down the back of her collar, because June was right, and she had known June was right, from the very moment she'd first read that letter sitting on her father's desk, and she had been running from that particular arithmetic ever since. Precisely because the honest answer frightened her a good deal more than any debt on earth ever could. She didn't sleep that night either. Lay awake instead, staring up at the ceiling, running the same numbers June had rightly accused her of avoiding for weeks now. What it would truly cost her, saying yes. Not in dollars, not primarily. In years. In mornings waking up beside a man who had never once asked what she thought about her own kitchen wallpaper, let alone the shape of the rest of her own life. In a whole lifetime spent being managed instead of properly asked, the way Wade had put it, sitting on that crate, with the lantern hissing low and patient between them. And underneath all of it, quieter, more dangerous than any of the rest combined, the thought of Wade Calloway's hand letting go of hers, careful, deliberate, the very instant she had found her balance. Even if it's not by me. She got up before dawn. Dressed in the cold dark, careful not to wake June, through the thin wall between their two rooms, and walked out to the barn, with no plan at all beyond a simple need to move, a need for the cold air to clear the whole tangle of everything currently sitting in her chest like a stone she couldn't quite swallow, or spit out. Wade was already there. Of course he was. Some men rose, with the light, and some men rose well, before it, and she was starting, slowly, to understand exactly which kind of man he was. He looked up when she came in. Read something in her face, she didn't fully know what, exactly, only that whatever he saw there made him set down the pail in his hand at once, and cross the barn toward her, slower than usual, careful, the way a man approaches a horse he can plainly tell has had a hard and difficult night of it. Opal. Her name. Not ma'am. Not Miss Kingston. Just her name, plain and entirely unguarded, the very first time he had ever said it to her, that particular way. Something in her chest broke loose at the sound of it. I found a letter, she said. The words came out rough, too fast, everything she'd been holding, since that morning in her father's study finally spilling loose all at once in the gray half-light of the barn. In my father's study. From your bank. From Corbin's bank. $4,200, Wade. That's what he owes them, plain and simple. That's what all of this is, underneath everything else. The engagement, the party, the wedding set for spring, none of it's about love, or ambition, or a good match at all. It's about a debt, with my name written straight into the terms of it, and I've spent 2 whole weeks trying to do the arithmetic on how to survive it, and I cannot. I cannot make the numbers come out to anything at all that I could bring myself to live with. Wade stood very still. Something moving behind his eyes, not surprise exactly, not really. More like a man watching a suspicion he'd carried along, while finally step out into the honest light of morning and confirm itself in full. 4,200, he said slowly. Contingent on the engagement proceeding as planned. That's the exact phrase used, word for word. Bennett's own hand, right there at the very bottom of the letter. Wade's jaw went tight. For a moment he said nothing at all, only stood there in the gray light, with his hands curled loose at his sides, and Opal watched something old and hard-earned move across his whole face, the particular stillness of a man revisiting a grief he had believed himself finished with, only to discover it hadn't quite finished with him after all. That's near enough the same figure, he said finally, quiet, as the note they called on my father years back. 11 years he'd carried it, faithful the whole while. 60 days they gave him to raise it whole and entire. He looked up at her. They didn't actually want it raised, Opal. They wanted the land itself. The debt was only ever the door they walked through to get to it. The words landed like ice water straight down her spine. You believe that's what this is? She said. Not a debt they're genuinely willing to forgive. A door. I believe, Wade said. That a bank patient enough to wait a full 11 years for one single ranch isn't the kind of bank that forgives $4,000 out of the plain goodness of anybody's heart. I believe there's a reason Harlan Corbin wants his son married squarely, onto Kingston land, and I do not believe for 1 minute that reason has anything whatsoever to do with love. Opal stood there in the cold barn, the gray lights strengthening slowly all around them, and felt the last soft edges of whatever hope she'd been quietly carrying, that this was simply a debt, ugly but survivable, a wound that might close clean, if she was only brave enough, or clever enough to manage it properly, harden all at once, into something else entirely. Not hope. Not yet fear either, not fully. Something colder and considerably more useful than either one. Resolve. Then I had better find out exactly what they're truly after, she said, before I go, and sign my whole life over to cover it blind. Wade looked at her a long moment. Something in his face that hadn't been there before, not quite pride, though it carried some of pride's particular warmth inside it. Recognition, maybe, closer to the truth of it. The particular look of a man watching someone step, for the very first time in his presence, fully into the whole weight of who they actually were underneath everything else. You'll want to be careful how you go about it, he said. A bank that's waited this long to finally close its hand isn't going to take any pleasure in being watched, while it does. I've been careful my whole life, Wade. Her voice came out steadier than she actually felt inside. I am tired, plainly, of careful getting me nowhere at all, but folded up smaller and smaller. Something that might, in a different man, in a different moment entirely, have grown into a full smile moved briefly at the corner of his mouth. He didn't let it all the way loose. But it was there, brief and entirely real, before he turned back toward the pail he'd set down. Then I'll help however I'm able to, he said. Whatever that turns out to mean, once we know the whole of it. Outside, the eastern sky had gone the color of a bruise healing, deep purple fading slowly toward gold at the horizon, the whole ranch emerging slow and silver out of the dark like something being remembered rather than simply seen. Somewhere across the yard, a rooster called, and then another, and the ordinary business of morning began assembling itself around them, entirely indifferent to everything that had just passed between two people standing in a cold barn, with a debt, and a bank, and a wedding 7 days off, all of it suddenly, dangerously, uncertain in a way it hadn't been the night before. Opal Kingston stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the light come up over land her family had held for 2 full generations, and might, if Wade was right about any of it, be about to lose to the very same patient hunger that had already swallowed his own family whole, once before, a decade back. She thought of her father, walking the property alone every single evening, circling a problem he hadn't yet found the shape of. She thought of Bennett's hand on the porch rail. More claim than affection. She thought of the ledger waiting for her back at the house, its long familiar columns, the only true language in this whole tangled arrangement, that had never once, in 11 years, lied to her about anything at all. Whatever they're truly after, she thought, walking back toward the house, as the sun finally cleared the ridge line, the numbers will tell me in the end. They always do, without fail. I only have to be brave enough, this time, to ask them the right question. Behind her, the barn door creaked once in the wind. And somewhere past the ridge, 7 days off now, and closing fast, the engagement party waited, bright with lanterns, thick with expected guests, built, she understood now, with a clarity that frightened her, on a foundation a good deal less solid than anyone gathered at that table had the faintest idea of. The party did not come in 7 days after all. Harlan Corbin sent word, through Bennett, that the timing wanted adjusting. Bank business, he said. A note due in Cheyenne that couldn't wait. Nothing urgent, he assured them. Nothing that couldn't hold until the roads improved properly, and the right families could travel to witness the whole affair conducted the way it deserved to be conducted. Opal understood the truth of it, before her father ever did. A banker never delays a good deal, without a reason worth the delaying. And Harlan Corbin, in her whole experience of him, had never once in his life done anything at all, without first calculating the full return on it. What the delay also did, though nobody said this part out loud at the time, was quietly satisfy the letter's own hard deadline, without anyone having to test it. The engagement itself, Opal came to understand later, watching her father's shoulders ease by some small fraction, that following week, had been the true condition all along, not the wedding, not the party. The moment Elias Kingston stood up at that first dinner, and announced it, before witnesses, the arrangement was already proceeding, as planned in the strict language of the letter, whatever calendar the actual ceremony eventually settled on. The 1st of January came, and went that year, with no fresh demand arriving from the bank at all, and her father breathed easier for exactly that reason, though he never once explained as much to Opal directly. She worked it out herself, the way she worked out most things in that house, alone, at a kitchen table, with a column of figures for company. So the party waited. Which meant winter arrived first. Which meant 5 long months stretched out ahead of her like a held breath she didn't fully know how to release. 5 months of ledgers by lamplight. 5 months of watching her father's shoulders bow lower under a weight he still hadn't properly named out loud to her, even now, even knowing she'd found the letter. 5 months of Wade Calloway, steady as ever on the surface, saying almost nothing more about that morning in the barn, about the letter, about any of it directly, except that something in the way he looked at her now had plainly changed. Careful. Deliberate. Like a man guarding something he had quietly decided, without ever saying so out loud, was worth the guarding. Winter came hard that year. It always did, in that part of the country, but that particular year it came harder than most. Snow past the fence rails by December, ice thick enough on the stock tanks to need breaking twice a day, without fail, the whole ranch drawn down slowly to its bare essentials the way winter always drew a place down, until you could finally see exactly what it was made of underneath all the softer seasons. Which was precisely when Elias Kingston started testing Wade Calloway in earnest, without ever once naming it a test out loud. The first test came dressed plainly as weather. Because that was simply how Elias did things, and had always done things. Never a direct question. Never "Are you the man my daughter thinks you are?" spoken plain across a supper table. Just a task, handed over flat, and ordinary, and then a long, careful watching to see exactly how it landed on the man given it. "Ridge fence needs mending," Elias said one gray morning, not quite looking at Wade, as he said it, his eyes fixed instead on some middle distance past the barn. "West line. Storm's coming in 2 days, maybe less than that if the wind holds this direction." "I'll get on it," Wade said. No hesitation at all in it. "Alone?" Elias's eyes flicked up then. Sharp. Measuring. "Crew's got the south pasture to see to this week." "You'll be entirely on your own out there, whatever happens." No mention of extra pay for it. No mention of what would happen if the fence failed to hold before the storm hit in earnest, and the herd scattered clean across 3 counties of open range, undone in a single bad night what had taken years to properly build. Just the task itself, handed over plain, and the silence settling in, after it, and the particular weight of a father watching closely to see whether another man would flinch under the weight of it. Wade didn't flinch, not even slightly. He was gone, before sunup the very next morning. Gone before Opal even woke, which she only learned, because she went looking for him at the calving shed, and found Boyd there instead, the ranch's longtime foreman, mending tack by lamplight, who told her, without once looking up from his work, that Calloway had ridden out well, before light with a wagon full of posts, and wire and a good coil of rope he might well need, if the drifts turned out worse than expected. She didn't sleep well, those 2 long nights that followed. Lay awake instead listening to the wind pick up hard outside her window, thinking of a man entirely alone on a ridge, with nothing at all but wire and stubbornness standing between him and a storm that didn't care one particle how good his intentions happened to be. He came back on the second evening, frostbitten at the fingertips, half frozen clean through his coat, his face wind-burned raw. But the fence line was standing, every single post reset by his own 2 hands, every strand of wire drawn tight enough to hold through whatever that storm had left in reserve to throw at it, and he had finished the whole job a full day ahead of the weather actually breaking. Her father walked the line himself the very next morning, in the thin gray light, after the storm had finally passed through, and said absolutely nothing at all, when he came back to the house. Just stood on the porch a long while, looking out steadily toward the ridge, his jaw working the particular way it did, when he was chewing on something he didn't yet properly know how to swallow whole. That evening, in front of the whole crew gathered at supper, Boyd tried to give Wade the full credit for it outright. Loud, the way Boyd tended to do most things in life, clapping him once hard across the shoulder. Man held that entire west line by himself, Boyd said, grinning wide. 2 full days, no help at all, storm bearing down the whole while. That right there is the kind of hand worth keeping on, no question about it. Wade didn't take the praise. Didn't even let it properly land on him. Wasn't just me, he said. Quiet, but firm enough to cut clean through the noise of the whole table. Cole did the heavy post work back this past fall. Line wouldn't have held near so well without what he'd already set down before I ever got out there. Then he got up, walked off toward the bunkhouse, before anyone at that table could make more of the moment than he'd already allowed them to. Opal watched him go. Watched her father watch him go too, from the head of the table, something moving quietly behind his eyes that plainly hadn't been there the week before. Because that was the thing about a man who deflected credit outright instead of grabbing for it with both hands. It told you something about his true character that no amount of hard work alone, on its own, ever quite could. The second test came dressed just as plainly as money. Elias left the wage pouch sitting in the tack room, deliberately, though he would never once admit to it directly, left it out on the shelf, where Wade had been sent specifically to fetch the crew's pay book, the count inside made purposefully heavy, made easy, made, if a man happened to be inclined, that particular way, into something that could disappear quietly, into a coat pocket, and never once be missed. Until the books came up short some weeks later, long after any blame could be properly traced. Wade brought both the pouch and the books straight to the house, before supper that same evening. Set them down together on the porch rail. Waited there without a word. "Count's wrong here, sir," he said. Plain as a man reporting the weather. "Short 2 men's wages entirely. Long on mine by that same amount." Elias took the pouch back slow. Studied Wade's face the whole while he did it, the same way he studied a horse he was seriously considering buying, looking hard for the one tell that would tell him absolutely everything he needed to know about the animal. "You didn't think to keep the difference quiet?" he said. Not entirely a question. "Wasn't mine to keep quiet, sir." Wade's hands stayed loose at his sides the whole time, his weight settled easy back, onto his heels, nothing at all defensive in the posture of it. Just a man stating a plain fact he considered altogether too obvious to bother arguing over. Elias turned the pouch over once in his own hands. Like it had told him something he hadn't especially wanted to hear confirmed that particular evening. He let the matter drop entirely, right there. But around the yard, that whole week following, Opal noticed he watched Wade differently than before. Less like a man waiting patiently for a mistake to finally happen. More like a man waiting, almost fully against his own stubborn will in the matter, to be proven wrong about something he had already half decided, privately, in his own mind. The third test was the one that very nearly broke something loose in her for good. Elias called Wade up to the porch alone one evening in late February, the light going thin and blue over the settled snow. Opal watched the whole exchange, from the kitchen window, June standing beside her, both of them frozen still at the sink, with their dish towels entirely forgotten in their hands. Her father stood squarely at the rail. Didn't offer Wade so much as a chair to sit in. "There's good work 2 counties over," he said. Opal couldn't hear the whole of it clean through the glass, but she caught enough of it, caught the general shape of what was actually happening even before June's hand found her arm, and gripped it tight, without either of them quite meaning to. Fair pay, from what I understand of it. I'll write you a letter of recommendation myself, in my own hand. All you need to do is be gone clean, before the party. Before the party? Before Bennett Corbin stood up in front of the whole assembled county, and claimed her formally, once and for all. Before there was any further danger at all of a hired hand, and a promised woman standing too close together at some calving shed, correcting each other's arithmetic in the dark, letting something grow steadily between them, that a father already carrying a secret debt simply couldn't afford to let grow any further than it already had. Opal's chest went tight enough, right then, to genuinely hurt. She watched Wade let the offer sit there a moment, unanswered. Not rushing at all to answer it either way. Not rushing to refuse it outright either, just standing there in the thinning light, turning the whole thing over the exact way he turned everything over, careful, unhurried, weighing the full cost of it properly, before he ever opened his mouth to speak. "Your daughter can send me away, Mr. Kingston," he said finally. Loud enough, this particular time, that the words carried clean through the window glass to where the two sisters stood frozen at the sink. "You cannot buy me away from her." Her father's jaw worked once hard. Something in his eyes changed, plainly, right there, and Opal saw it clearly even through the glass, even at that particular distance. Not defeat exactly. Something closer to genuine respect, arriving somewhere inside him he plainly hadn't planned on ever letting it arrive to. He didn't speak to Wade again, that whole evening. Just stood there at the rail alone, while after Wade had already walked back off toward the bunkhouse, hands pushed deep into his pockets, his breath fogging pale against the darkening winter sky. June turned away from the window first. Set her own dish towel down at last, with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "That's the very first time," she said quiet, "I have ever once seen Pa look at a hired hand the exact way he looks at a man he genuinely respects." Opal said nothing at all in reply. Couldn't manage it. Her throat had gone far too tight for any words at all, watching her father stand there alone on that porch, working through arithmetic all his own kind, the kind that didn't run in plain dollars at all, the kind that maybe, finally, after everything, was starting to run steadily in her own favor instead. She found Wade at the stable 2 full nights later. His bedroll was already packed tight and ready. His pay envelope sat unopened on the foreman's own desk, entirely untouched, as though he hadn't yet properly decided whether he'd earned the right to take it with him at all. Something in her chest went cold clean through at the sight of it laid out that way. "You were going to leave," she said. "Without so much as a single word to me first." He pulled the strap on the bedroll tight, before he finally looked over at her. His whole face had none of its usual steadiness left in it, something raw and unguarded sitting just underneath, something he plainly wasn't managing to keep as level as he usually kept every single thing about himself. "I was leaving," he said, "before they went, and made you ashamed of ever having known me at all. This town's got its own particular way of making that look ugly, whether it truly is or isn't underneath. I was never once ashamed of you, Wade. Not for a single moment." She crossed the space between them, before she'd even properly decided to. Stood close enough now that she could plainly see the exhaustion sitting behind his eyes, the particular tiredness of a man who had spent an entire hard winter proving himself, over and over to a father who wasn't even properly his own, all for the sake of a woman he had told himself, again and again, he had no real right at all to want for himself. He looked at her long enough, in that moment, that it would have been easy, forgivable, even under the circumstances, to simply reach for her. He didn't. "I won't ask you to choose me," he said low, "while your own father's still out there choosing everything for you instead. That's not a real choice at all, Opal. That's simply trading one man's plan for another man's plan, and calling it something better than it truly is." He didn't leave that particular night, in the end. But he didn't reach for her either, not that night, and she walked back to the house alone, through the bitter cold, her chest aching in a way that had absolutely nothing at all to do with the weather itself. Because winter, for all its plain hardness, at least had the decency to stay simple. Cold was cold, full stop. Work was work, full stop. A fence either held through a storm, or it plainly didn't, and a man either did right by a stray wage pouch left out, or he quietly pocketed it instead, and there was a certain rough mercy in problems, that clean and that straightforward to judge. Spring brought no such mercy along with it at all. Spring brought Bennett Corbin, riding out considerably more often now that the roads had finally cleared properly, his visits stretching longer each time, his questions growing sharper by the week. He had taken lately to walking the property alongside her father some evenings, the two of them deep in low conversation Opal was never once properly invited to overhear in full, though she caught fragments of it drifting across the yard on the spring wind. Water rights, she heard once distinctly, an upper section, and a short laugh, from Bennett that carried no real warmth in it at all. She should have paid a great deal closer attention to all of it. She told herself that plainly, later, more times than she could ever properly count. She had been so entirely consumed, that whole winter, with watching her father, watching Wade, watching the slow careful thaw of genuine respect building steadily between two men, who had started, that same winter, as wary strangers. She simply hadn't been watching Bennett Corbin closely enough, not nearly closely enough. Which was, she came to understand only much later, exactly the mistake he had been quietly counting on her making the entire time. The water line ran along the whole north boundary of the property, feeding the upper stock tank steadily, from a small earthen dam built 2 full generations back by Opal's own grandfather. Nothing especially grand about it, just packed earth, and old timber holding back enough of the spring runoff each year to keep the herd properly watered clean, through the driest months still ahead. It had held steady, without fail, for a full 40 years running. It broke on a Thursday night in early April, and it most certainly did not break by any accident at all. Opal knew that plainly, the very instant she first saw it, standing at the ragged edge of the wreckage in the first gray light of dawn, the water still roaring loud, and brown and utterly furious down, through the whole lower pasture, half the north fence line already torn clean out, and dragged a full 50 yards downstream by the sheer force of it. Because a dam that fails purely, from old age fails slow, always. Fails with clear warning signs. Cracks visible for weeks beforehand to anyone bothering to look closely enough at it. This particular dam had held perfectly fine only 3 days before. Boyd had checked it himself, that week, walking the whole earthworks the exact way he walked them every single week, without fail, and had found nothing at all wrong with it then. Which meant somebody had gone out and opened it deliberately by hand. Which meant somebody had known exactly where the one true weak point in the whole structure sat, because her grandfather's old dam did have one, a section of old timber, softer through than the rest of it, that only a man, who had studied that particular water line closely, at length, would ever have managed to find on his own. Opal's stomach dropped straight clean, through the ground beneath her. Bennett's been walking this exact property, with Pa all spring long. She didn't have time enough to even finish that particular thought properly. Because the water was still rising fast, and half the herd was already scattered somewhere out across the flooding plain below, and Wade was already up in the saddle, already shouting hard for Boyd to cut the fence clean at the south corner, before the current dragged any more of it loose downstream. She ran flat out for the barn. Ran for her own horse, without a second thought. Because whatever had truly caused this, whatever it ultimately meant for all of them, it could plainly wait. The cattle simply could not. She would remember the whole of the next hour only in scattered pieces afterward. The particular way a person remembers a bad fever, not whole, not properly in order, only flashes bright enough to genuinely burn themselves into memory for good. The water cold enough to fully stop her breath outright, closing hard over her boot the very instant her horse slipped badly on the churned mud of the bank. The horse going down hard beneath her. Herself going down right along, with it, into water moving faster than anything she had ever once fought against in her whole life, the current dragging her downstream, before she'd even properly finished the act of falling. Wade's voice, somewhere high above the roar of it all. Her own name, called twice, sharp enough to cut clean through the cold already fogging her whole mind. And then his arm, hard around her ribs, hauling her bodily up out of the current, with a strength that felt, in that one frozen half-second, like the only solid thing left standing in the entire drowning world around her. He got her to the bank at last. Got her breathing properly again, though she didn't rightly remember choosing to breathe at all, only the sudden violent return of air scraping raw down her whole throat, and Wade's hands, shaking badly now themselves, running fast over her arms and shoulders like he was checking, frantically, that she was still whole, before he could let himself properly believe it. "I'm all right," she managed to get out. Her own voice came out entirely wrong. Thin. Barely recognizable as her own. "You're not," Wade said. Rough. Furious in a way she had never once heard from him before, not in all these months. Not at her, she understood that much even, through the cold, and the shaking, that had taken her over completely. At the water itself. At whatever had truly caused all of this. At the whole helpless shape of very nearly losing her outright. "You're not all right, Opal, you went clean under. You went back in after them." She grabbed hard for his sleeve, suddenly a great deal more frightened for him than she had even been for herself in that whole terrible moment. Because she remembered that now, the very last piece of the whole fever memory finally sliding into place, Wade turning away from the bank the instant she was safely clear of the water, plunging straight back into that current, after the 3 head of cattle still trapped hard against the broken fence line, disappearing clean under the brown water for seconds that had stretched out endless and entirely unbearable to watch. He had surfaced again barely. Dragged 2 of the 3 steers to shallow water, with a length of rope lashed tight around his own waist, Boyd hauling hard on the other end, from the bank, with absolutely everything he had left in him, shouting Wade's own name into the roar the entire, while like a man shouting out a desperate prayer. The 3rd steer, in the end, they lost outright to the flood. Wade himself, they did not lose. He knelt now on the muddy bank beside her, soaked entirely through, his lips gone faintly blue, with the cold blood running thin from a gash along his temple, where something loose in the flood had caught him hard. And still his hands stayed on her shoulders, still his whole eyes were fixed steady on her face, like nothing else at all in the whole ruined morning mattered even half so much as she did right then. "Don't you ever," he said, his voice cracking clean down the middle, "do that to me again. Not ever." She laughed. It came out broken, half a genuine sob underneath it. "I didn't do it on purpose, Wade. I know that." He pulled her hard against him then, finally, the careful distance he'd kept between them the entire long winter simply gone at last, washed away clean along with everything else the flood had already taken that morning. "I know that plainly. Doesn't make any of it easier to bear." She felt his heart going hard against her ear, felt the cold shaking steadily through both of them together in the gray morning light, and understood, with a clarity that cut clean through the whole fog of shock and river water both, that whatever careful line he had been so deliberately drawing between them all winter long had just been swept away for good, every bit as surely as her grandfather's old dam had been. They carried Wade back to the house on a makeshift litter a full hour later, when the cold and the steady blood loss both finally caught up with him all at once, and his knees buckled clean out from under him crossing the yard. Opal walked beside him the whole way, one hand fisted tight in his sleeve like she could somehow hold him upright through sheer stubborn refusal alone. Her father met them right there on the porch. He had been out at the actual break himself by then, had seen the water firsthand, seen the ruined fence, seen, Opal would only learn this part later, the particular clean edge on the old broken timber, where it had finally given way, an edge that no 40 full years of slow natural rot could ever possibly have produced on its own. He looked hard at Wade, pale and visibly shaking on the litter. Looked at his own daughter's hand fisted tight in the man's soaked sleeve, her hair still dripping river water steadily onto the porch boards beneath her. He didn't say a single word at all about propriety. Didn't say one word about engagements, or Corbin money, or anything at all, that had governed nearly every decision he made the entire long winter through. "Bring him inside," Elias said, his voice steady and sure. "Put him right by the fire, and somebody fetch clean water and bandages." Opal sat up, with him through the very worst of that long night, changing the dressing on the cut at his temple herself, her hands finally steady again, though her mind kept circling back, over and over, without pause, to that clean edge on the broken timber. Because it plainly wasn't rot. She had seen genuine rot before, plenty of times, over the years, knew exactly and precisely what 40 full years of slow water damage actually looked like against old wood. This was cut through, clean and deliberate. Which meant someone had gone out to that dam, alone, with a proper tool in hand, and had deliberately weakened the one single section strong enough to hold the whole earthen structure together at all. Which meant someone had chosen the exact timing of it too, chosen a particular night, when the spring runoff would be running at its highest, when the eventual break would do the very most damage possible, take the most cattle, cost the very most money to repair. Which meant this had never once been any kind of accident at all. Which meant she needed, urgently, to know exactly who. Wade stirred near midnight, fever warm still, but fully lucid now, his eyes finding hers immediately in the low firelight the second they opened. "You should be sleeping," he said. His voice came out rough. Half a smile trying its best to work its way up, through the sheer exhaustion still sitting heavy on him. "So should you." She pressed the cool cloth carefully to his forehead, mindful around the stitching Boyd had done earlier, that evening, clumsy but altogether serviceable enough. "You very nearly drowned twice, over in one single morning, Wade Calloway. I don't much care, right now, what you personally think I ought to be doing instead." "Fair enough, I suppose." He caught her wrist gently, before she could pull the cloth fully away. Held it there, loose, the fever making his grip a good deal weaker than she had ever once felt it before. "Opal. Don't you dare say anything noble to me right now. You're plainly concussed." Wasn't going to be noble about it at all. His thumb moved once, slow, against the soft inside of her wrist. Was only going to say, that dam didn't rightly break itself, not on its own. Her breath caught hard in her throat. "You saw it too, then?" "Saw the timber plain enough. Clean cut, not rot at all." His jaw tightened, the fever flush deepening further across his cheekbones, as he spoke. Somebody wanted that particular break to happen, and wanted it happening badly enough, that they were willing to risk drowning half your whole herd in the process of arranging it. Bennett's been walking, that exact section, with my father the whole spring," Opal said, quiet, the words tasting bitter, as poison even, as she made herself finally say them plainly out loud for the very first time to anyone. "Asking pointed questions about water rights, over and over. I heard bits of it drifting, from the yard, and never once thought a single thing of it at the time." Wade's eyes, glassy still with fever, sharpened all the same, fast. "Then that's precisely where you need to start looking," he said. "Not at the dam itself. At whatever it is he genuinely wants, that particular stretch of water line to be worth to him." She started the very next morning, well before her father was even properly awake, pulling every single ledger the whole ranch owned down off the study shelves, and spreading every one of them out flat across the kitchen table like a woman laying careful siege to a fortress she fully intended to take. Because if the numbers themselves would never lie to her outright, and they truly never once had, not in 11 whole years of careful columns balanced faithfully by lamplight, then somewhere buried in this whole mess of ink and figures, the honest truth of what Bennett Corbin actually wanted out of all of this would be sitting there patiently, waiting for someone careful enough, and stubborn enough, to finally find it. She worked steadily through the whole morning. Through the entire afternoon after that, without pause. June brought her coffee, that she let go stone cold twice, over without noticing. Boyd came by the kitchen twice to report on the fence repairs, and left both times, without her fully registering that he had spoken to her at all. Because the deeper she dug into it all, the stranger the whole shape of the thing steadily became. The upper water rights, the ones tied directly to That exact section of the broken dam, the very same stretch Bennett had been walking so carefully all spring long, weren't simply Kingston land outright, the way she had always assumed, without ever once properly checking. They were split. Split, according to an old survey filed decades back, cleanly between the Kingston ranch on one side, and the parcel of land sitting just north of it on the other. The very parcel that, according to a county filing dated a full 11 years prior, had been formally seized outright by Corbin County Bank and Trust from a family listed plainly in the record as Calloway. Opal sat very still at the kitchen table, the old filing spread open flat in front of her, her heart going hard enough in her chest that she could genuinely hear it pounding in her own ears. Calloway. She read the filing again. Then a full third time through. Her hands, she noticed distantly, as though observing someone else entirely, had started to shake badly. Because there, written plainly in the bank's own careful hand, was a note she strongly doubted anyone outside that bank had ever once bothered reading closely in the full 11 years since it had first been filed away, a note explaining that the original seizure had been executed strictly on a technicality. A missed payment date, off by a mere 9 days, on an otherwise entirely current note. 9 short days, set against 11 full years of otherwise faithful, unbroken payment. 9 days that had cost one whole family absolutely everything they had ever owned. And underneath that particular note, tucked into a column she very nearly missed entirely on her first 2 readings, buried deep in the fine print of the original old survey, sat the water rights attached specifically to that parcel. Rights that, by the strict letter of the old filing itself, should properly have transferred cleanly along with the land the moment the bank formally seized it. Except they plainly hadn't. Because somewhere buried deep in all the accompanying paperwork, Opal traced the whole thread of it forward carefully, through 3 further documents, before she finally found the exact discrepancy, her pulse climbing steadily. With every single page she turned, the water rights themselves had never actually once been properly recorded, as transferred at all. A simple clerical oversight, perhaps. Or something rather less innocent than that entirely. Either way, by the strict and literal letter of the county's own official filings, those particular water rights still, technically, belonged outright to whoever legally held the original Calloway claim. Which meant the exact section of dam Bennett Corbin had been, so carefully, deliberately interested in walking all spring long wasn't fully his own family's to control outright after all. Which meant somebody, at some point, had finally realized that dangerous gap sitting open in the paperwork. Which meant somebody wanted it fixed, permanently and quietly, before anyone else ever noticed it themselves, and moved to make a proper claim on it first. Opal sat back hard, from the table, her breath gone shallow, the whole tangled shape of the entire matter finally resolving itself clear in front of her the precise way a long column of figures finally resolves clear the moment you've found the single error throwing off every other sum beneath it. He didn't sabotage that dam to hurt us, she thought. He sabotaged it to destroy the evidence for good. Because a broken dam meant necessary repairs. Meant entirely new construction, fresh surveys, brand new filings, and in the whole process of that reconstruction, the old paperwork gap could simply vanish for good, quietly buried beneath a stack of new documents nobody would ever once think to properly compare back against the original filing. Except it hadn't vanished after all. Because Opal Kingston kept her ledgers the exact same way other women kept their scripture, faithfully, completely, with a genuine memory for detail, that had once been casually dismissed by half this county, as merely a young woman's odd habit, and was about to become, without a single soul in that county yet suspecting it, the single most dangerous thing sitting inside Harlan Corbin's carefully managed little empire. She stood up from the table, so fast her chair scraped hard and loud against the wooden floor. She needed Wade. Needed to show him all of this at once, needed him to fully understand what she had just found sitting right there, hidden in plain sight, inside his own family's stolen land, a claim, still alive after all these years, still legally tangled up in water rights nobody had ever properly bothered closing the loop on. She needed her father too, badly. Needed him to finally see, laid out plain in black, and white, exactly what kind of man he had very nearly married her off to, without ever once asking her. And underneath all of it, cold now and entirely clear, and utterly unshakable, she needed something else besides. Something that had absolutely nothing at all to do anymore with simple survival, or careful arithmetic, or managing her own way politely, through a debt that had never truly, from the very start, been about any wedding at all. She needed Bennett Corbin himself to understand, before this whole business was finally finished, exactly how badly he had underestimated the particular woman he had once looked over across a dinner table, and weighed coolly, like nothing more than a simple line item in somebody else's ledger. She found Wade out on the porch, still pale from the lingering fever, wrapped tight in a blanket June had forced on him firmly against his own protests, watching the last of the receding floodwater work its slow way steadily down through the whole lower pasture below. He looked up sharply when the screen door banged shut behind her. Read something plain in her face at once that made him sit up considerably straighter despite the exhaustion still sitting heavy across his whole shoulders. "You found something," he said. Not a question at all. "I found everything." Opal crossed the porch quickly, the old filing clutched tight in both hands, and knelt down beside his chair, so she could set it flat across his knees, where he could properly see it plain for himself. "Wade, your family's water rights. They never once actually transferred, with the land at all. The bank's own filing proves it, it's all right here, buried under 3 other documents, but it's genuinely here. Which means Bennett didn't break that dam simply to hurt us." Wade's eyes moved steadily over the page, slow at first, then considerably faster, the color rising fast in his whole face now, that had nothing left to do with any lingering fever at all. "He broke it," he said, his voice gone rough. "To bury this. To bury the truth of it for good. Before anyone else ever thought to properly look for it. Before I ever thought to look for it myself." He looked up hard at her, something fierce and thoroughly disbelieving moving across his whole face all at once. "Opal, I spent a full 3 years, after they took that land from us, trying to find some crack, any crack at all, in the paperwork. Some genuine mistake I could finally hold them to account for. I never once found it. Gave up looking eventually, in the end. Told myself plainly it simply wasn't there to be found at all. It was there the entire time," Opal said, quiet. Sitting in a filing cabinet 3 whole counties over, waiting patiently for somebody who actually knew how to read it properly. Wade's hand found hers, where it rested on the page between them. Held it firm. Not careful this time, not holding back at all. Not letting go the instant she found her balance, the way he always had before. "Then we had better make entirely sure," he said, "that when this whole truth finally comes out, it comes out somewhere Harlan Corbin cannot possibly manage to quietly bury it a second time over." Opal thought of the party. Still coming, still waiting somewhere out ahead of them in the thin gray spring light, bright with lanterns, and thick with every important family in the whole county gathered together under one single roof to witness her formal engagement to a man who had tried, deliberately, to drown half her family's herd simply to protect a lie. Something cold and entirely clear and absolutely certain settled deep into her chest right then. "I know exactly where," she said. Behind them, through the kitchen window, she could hear her own father's voice, low and urgent, talking steadily with Boyd about the necessary repairs to the dam, about the strange clean cut in that old timber, that neither one of them could rightly explain away any longer, as simple accident. The truth was moving now, gathering the exact way floodwater gathers, patient and entirely certain, behind a wall that had already, once before, proven conclusively that it couldn't hold forever against the pressure. It was only, now, a plain matter of time, before it finally broke wide open in front of absolutely everyone. The party finally came in May. Warm by then, at long last. Green pushing up steadily, through the mud the flood had left behind, the fence lines fully mended, the whole herd counted, and carefully recounted, until the numbers finally sat right again in Opal's own ledger. Ordinary life, or something close enough to it to pass for it, at least on the surface. Except nothing at all about that house felt remotely ordinary the night of the party itself. Because lanterns hung the full length of the porch. Because carriages lined the drive 3 full deep, families arriving from as far off as the county seat to witness what Harlan Corbin had built his entire reputation on witnessing properly, a good match, sealed the right way, in front of every single soul who genuinely mattered in that county. Opal stood at her bedroom window watching them all arrive. June stood behind her, fastening the last button at her collar, her hands quick and steady, though her voice, when she finally spoke, was not. "You're entirely sure?" June said. "About tonight of all nights? I have never once in my whole life been sure of anything at all. Pa doesn't know the whole of it yet, mind you." "Not truly. Not the water rights, not any part of that." "He will," Opal said. "Everyone in that room will, before the night is through." June's hand stilled on that last button. Met her sister's own eyes steady in the mirror, something fierce and frightened both moving across her face at the very same moment. "Then let's you and I go be sure of it together." The dining room glowed gold, with lantern light, the very same room where all of this had first started, her father's glass rising high, her whole future decided flat, over roast beef, before she'd even properly set the plates down, that first night. Tonight the table ran longer. The guest list considerably larger. Harlan Corbin sat near the head of it, gray and solid, and entirely certain of exactly how this evening would unfold, from start to finish, the same unshakable certainty that had carried him steadily through 11 full years of patient, unhurried ruin. Bennett stood when the proper moment finally came. Raised his glass exactly the way his own father had long ago taught him to raise it, high enough for the whole room to see clearly, timed to the exact precise second, when every separate conversation would naturally hush itself to listen. "To the joining," he said, his voice carrying warm and easy clean across the whole room, "of 2 fine families. Of land. Of credit. And of—" No. One single word. Quiet. But it landed in that whole crowded room like a dropped plate shattering, sharp enough that every single head in the place turned at once toward the sound of it. Opal stood at the far end of the table. Hadn't fully planned to interrupt him mid-sentence like that, had planned, if she was honest with herself, on something a good deal more composed, something with a proper beginning, and a proper measured build to it. But the word had come loose entirely, before she could hold it back, and now there was simply no version left of this whole evening that didn't run straight through it. "I will not marry a man," she said, "who wants this ranch more than he has ever once wanted me." The room went still enough, right then, to hear the fire itself snapping soft in the hearth. Bennett's smile thinned hard at the edges, the very first genuine crack Opal had ever once seen appear in that careful, practiced banker's warmth of his. "Are you meaning to shame your own father?" he said low. "Right here in his own house, in front of everyone." Every single eye in that whole room found Elias Kingston at once. He could have silenced her outright, with one single word. This whole thing would have ended right there, her humiliation folded quietly back into the ordinary flow of the evening, the deal itself saved, the debt quietly forgiven, everyone's dignity left fully intact except her own alone. He set his glass down instead, slow and entirely deliberate. The very same gesture precisely that he had made the night all of this first began, except everything sitting underneath it now had changed completely. "My daughter," he said, "has spoken plainly. And I intend to stand behind every word of it." Somewhere near the doorway, among the hired hands, who had been brought in specially to carry extra chairs and keep the lamps properly trimmed, Wade Calloway stood entirely still. He did not step forward, not yet. Waited instead, the exact way he waited for everything in life, careful, unhurried, until Opal's own eyes finally found his clean across the crowded room. Then he crossed it. Every single step of it deliberate, every eye in that whole dining room tracking him the entire way across, until he stood a full arm's length from her at last, had held in his hand. "I have nothing at all," he said, quiet enough that only the nearest guests could properly hear him. To offer that's equal to this whole ranch. I never once asked for equal. Opal held his eyes steady in front of the whole room, in front of Harlan Corbin's own cold gray stare, in front of every single family who had come out that night to watch her be quietly handed over like some settled account balance. I asked, all along, only for honest? This is genuinely absurd, Harlan Corbin said, rising now himself, his voice gone hard in a way that finally, plainly matched the true man sitting underneath all that banker's practiced warmth. A hired ranch hand, and a broken engagement, over what exactly? Some simple lover's quarrel between the two of you. Over a dam, Opal said. That most certainly did not break on its own. The whole room's low murmurs shifted at once, confusion sliding fast towards something considerably sharper. I found the original survey, she went on, and now her voice had gone entirely steady, steadier than she had felt all evening long, because this particular part she had rehearsed a full 100 times, over in her own head walking the fence lines these past 3 careful weeks. The water rights on the whole north section, filed away decades back, split cleanly between this ranch here and the parcel your own bank seized 11 full years ago, from a family listed plainly as Calloway. Harlan's face didn't move at all, not outwardly. But something behind his eyes plainly did, the very same cold arithmetic Opal had once watched Bennett himself perform at that very first dinner, recalculating fast now, searching hard for whatever angle might still let him walk this whole disaster back. Old paperwork, he said. Simple clerical matters, nothing more. Nothing at all, that properly concerns this particular evening. It concerns this evening a great deal, Opal said, because your own son broke my family's dam specifically to bury it for good. Cut the timber clean, through himself, not rot, not simple age cut, and did it the very same week you yourself started asking pointed questions about that section's water rights. And very nearly drowned 2 separate people doing it. A genuine gasp moved through the whole room now, real and clearly audible, the particular sound a crowd makes when a story it believed it fully understood suddenly reveals a second, considerably uglier story hiding underneath the first one the entire time. That is a genuinely serious accusation to make, Harlan said. But his own voice had thinned out noticeably. Because a whole room full of neighbors, and rivals and men, who did steady business with his bank was listening hard to every word now, and a banker's entire fortune, in the end, is built on nothing at all but the trust of a room exactly like this one. It is also a fully documented one. Opal lifted the folder in her hand, the old survey, the original filing, the county record she had spent 3 whole careful weeks tracing thread by patient thread. I will be filing a formal claim with the county clerk directly, on behalf of the original Calloway right holder. And I expect, once word of tonight properly travels, and it most certainly will travel, Mr. Corbin, this whole county talks, every family in this room tonight is going to start wondering, quite reasonably, what else your bank has been quietly burying away in old paperwork these past 11 years. Harlan Corbin stood there a long moment, gray and solid, and for the very first time in Opal's whole memory of the man, entirely without a ready answer of any kind. Because that was the whole entire architecture of a man exactly like him. Built on patience alone. Built on the simple assumption that nobody would ever look closely enough, or long enough, to find the one crack running through it. And here it was now, cracked wide open at last, right in front of the one single audience, whose good opinion he genuinely could not survive losing. He turned toward his own son. Something cold and entirely final passing between the two of them, a father recalculating in real time, right there, exactly how much this whole evening's disaster was ultimately going to cost him going forward. We are leaving, he said flat. Bennett didn't argue the point at all. Didn't so much as glance back once toward Opal on his own way to the door, already recalculating himself too by then, already moving on in his mind toward whatever the next arrangement might turn out to be, some other family somewhere, some other ranch, some other woman he'd weigh coolly across some other dinner table like nothing more than a simple line item. The front door closed behind both of them, within the hour. Her father watched them go from the porch. Opal stood beside him in the cool night air, the whole party behind them slowly dissolving into confused, urgent murmuring, guests already trading the whole story back and forth eagerly like something far too valuable to keep entirely to themselves. Elias didn't look, for the first time in many long weeks, like a man still counting up everything he had lost. $4,200, he said, quiet, staring steadily out at the dark departing shapes of the carriages. I let that single number go, and decide your entire life for you, Opal. Didn't even have the plain decency to tell you the true size of it myself. I found it out anyway, in the end. I know that you did. He turned to look at her then, something raw moving openly across his whole face, that she had rarely once seen sit there before. I am sorry for it. That's a small enough thing to say, I know, for what I very nearly cost you outright. But it is the truest thing I have got to offer you tonight, for whatever it's worth now. You stopped him, she said, when it truly counted most. That is not a small thing at all, Pa. He was quiet a long moment after that. Then, lo, your own mother would have stood up in that very room the exact same way you just did tonight. A good 20 years younger, mind you, but that same fire in her exactly, down to the last spark of it. Opal's throat went tight at that. He rarely spoke of her mother at all anymore, let alone quite like this, soft and entirely unguarded, a man handing his own daughter something precious he had kept carefully locked away inside himself for a long, long while. I have missed seeing that particular fire in this house, he said. Glad, more than I can properly say, that it didn't skip a whole generation on its way down to you. The debt itself, it turned out in the end, still had one final twist left inside it. Because a bank, whose reputation had just cracked wide open in front of half the whole county, could not properly afford, in the weeks that followed, to be seen out calling in notes and squeezing struggling ranches across the region. Not with every single family in 3 separate counties now suddenly re-examining, closely, every piece of paper Corbin's bank had ever once handed them, over the years. The $4,200 was quietly extended, without further comment. No contingencies attached this time around. No conditions written into it at all about weddings, or engagements or anything else beyond simple, ordinary interest and simple, ordinary time to pay it down properly. It wasn't outright forgiveness, mind. Elias Kingston paid down every single dollar of it eventually, working the whole ranch a good deal harder, that particular year than he had in a full decade prior, Opal right there beside him at the ledgers every single evening, making entirely sure not one column ever ran soft on either of them. But it was breathing room, genuine and real. Which, after the particular winter and spring they had both just survived together, felt very close indeed to an outright miracle. The Callaway water rights claim itself took a good deal longer to settle properly. Months of steady county filings. A formal hearing, before the Land Commission, that Opal sat through beside Wade, with her hand gripped tight in his the entire while, watching a panel of tired men in heavy wool suits slowly, methodically confirm, point by careful point, exactly what she had first found buried in that old filing cabinet weeks and weeks before. The rights were fully restored in the end. Not the whole original parcel, mind, that particular land had long since been sold off entirely to other hands, tangled far too deep now in other separate claims to ever properly unwind clean. But the water itself, the water came back at last to the Callaway name, formally and permanently, recorded on a single piece of paper that Wade folded carefully and kept tucked inside his coat pocket for weeks afterward, like he couldn't quite bring himself to fully trust it was real, unless he could actually feel the weight of it there against his own chest. 11 whole years, he said to her once, sitting together on the porch step in the last warm gold light of a June evening. 11 years I told myself flat out there was nothing left worth fighting for anymore. Just land some banker's family had taken outright, and quietly turned entirely into money instead. And now I've got proper water rights, and no actual land left to put them on. He almost laughed then, shook his head slow at the strange shape the whole thing had finally taken. Never once imagined that particular thing would end up being what finally felt like winning, out of everything. Opal leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the sun drop slow below the ridge line, gold spreading thin, and warm clean across land her own family had held now for 2 full generations, and had very nearly lost outright to the very same patient hunger that had once taken his family's whole. "There's good water running on this side of the fence too, you know," she said. Careful. Testing the honest shape of the idea, before she let herself say it plain out loud. "A good deal more land, altogether, than just 2 people rightly need to properly farm alone." Wade went very still beside her at that. "Opal Kingston," he said slowly, "are you sitting here proposing to me, on a porch step plain as that?" "I am simply stating an honest arithmetic fact about acreage, nothing more." But she was smiling now, wide, and he could plainly hear it sitting right there in her own voice even, without needing to turn and look at her face to confirm it. "Whatever else you personally choose to make of that fact is entirely your own business from here." He turned then, looked at her the exact way he had looked at her, that very first night in the barn, all those months back, nothing performed in it at all, nothing weighed or measured, nothing at all held carefully back this time. "I intend to make a good deal of it," he said, "if you will only let me. I do believe I already offered." He kissed her then, finally, slow and entirely certain, nothing careful left in it at all anymore, the very last of that deliberate distance he had guarded so carefully between them all, through that long hard winter now fully, completely gone for good. They married that same June, under the tall cottonwoods at the edge of the north pasture, right where the freshly mended fence line ran clean and strong along ground that had very nearly washed clean away entirely back in April. June stood up for her own sister, crying steadily before the vows had even properly started, dabbing hard at her own eyes, with a handkerchief she managed to ruin twice, over completely before the preacher finally finished. Boyd stood proudly among the assembled hands crowded close near the fence to watch, grinning wide enough to properly embarrass himself in front of everyone, and plainly didn't care one single bit about it. Her father gave her away himself. Steadier, Opal thought, watching him walk her slowly up that short aisle, than anyone who had watched him carry a secret debt, and his own daughter's uncertain future all, through that long, hard winter would ever once have rightly guessed he could manage to be. He didn't cry at all during the actual ceremony itself. He waited, Opal learned much later, from June, until he was fully alone, that same evening out on the porch, the party still going on warm and loud behind him inside the house, before he finally let it out, quiet and entirely private, the particular mingled grief and joy of a father watching his own daughter step fully, finally, into a whole life that belonged wholly to her, and to no one else at all. The years that followed were not, by any measure, easy ones. Nobody's ranch years ever truly were, in that particular country, in that particular time in history. There was one dry summer that cost them a full fifth of the whole herd outright. One winter so hard the water line froze solid clean through for 11 straight days running. Prices that dropped hard one season, and then climbed back up unpredictably the very next, with no real pattern to any of it a person could properly plan around. But Opal and Wade faced down every single one of those hard years together, side by side, ledgers open flat between them at that very same kitchen table, where she had once first found the letter that changed absolutely everything about her whole life, working through each fresh crisis together the exact way they had first worked through that very first one, her numbers, his steady hands, both of them stubborn enough, and honest enough, with each other, always, that nothing at all ever quite managed to properly break them apart. Elias grew slower, with each passing season that followed. Quieter, too, in his own way. Content, Opal thought, watching him from a distance some evenings, in a way she genuinely hadn't seen in him, since well before her own mother had passed the particular hard-won ease of a man, who had finally stopped fighting so hard against the true shape of his own life, and had simply let himself, at last, properly enjoy whatever years still remained to him. He held their very first child out on the porch the first truly warm evening of the following spring, awkward and careful in his own big work-worn hands, and wept without a single sound, when he genuinely believed no one at all was watching him do it. Opal was watching, in fact, the whole time. She never once told him so. Some moments in a life, she had slowly learned by then, were simply better left entirely uninterrupted by anyone at all. Years turned over steadily the way ranch years always do turn, slow and grinding in the actual living of them day to day, and then somehow entirely sudden in the looking back on them all at once. A second child came along in time, then eventually a third, all three of them learning to properly sit a horse well, before any of them had rightly learned their own letters, exactly the same way Opal herself once had, a whole generation before them. Wade became the ranch's foreman first, taking over properly from Boyd when the older man's own knees finally gave out on him for good. Then, in time, partner in every practical fact of it, if never once quite formally in name, the one man every hired hand on that whole ranch looked to, without question whenever the weather turned genuinely hard, the one man Elias himself trusted, without a second thought given to it by then, with decisions that would once, not so many years before, have belonged to him, and him alone to make. On one of the last truly warm evenings, before winter properly set in, many years on now past that terrible, transformative spring that had changed everything, Elias sat out on the porch, with his own youngest grandchild settled comfortably on his knee, watching Opal and Wade down below in the yard, arguing mildly between themselves over some cattle count neither one of them would quite fully concede to the other. Both of them half laughing the whole while, because both of them, as usual then, were at least partly right about it. The old ranch ledger lay open flat on the porch rail beside him. Opal's own steady handwriting filling one whole page. Wade's filling the facing page across, from it, the two separate hands, so thoroughly intertwined by then, across so many long years of shared columns, and shared decisions, that a stranger glancing down at it might genuinely have struggled to say for certain exactly where one of them properly left off, and the other one truly began. Elias turned the ledger's own worn corner slowly between two fingers, speaking mostly to the small child on his knee, though his own eyes stayed fixed the whole while on the yard below. "I thought once that I was saving this whole place," he said, quiet, "picking bank money clean, over everything else in this world, that actually mattered a good deal more." The child tugged once, gently, at his sleeve. Waiting, the particular patient way small children always wait, for a story to properly finish itself the exact way stories are supposed to finish. "What happened then, Grandpa? Tell me the rest of it." Down below in the yard, Opal looked up just then. Found her husband's eyes waiting for hers across the fading golden light, something easy and entirely certain passing quietly between the two of them, that needed no words at all to properly carry it. Elias closed his own hand gently over the worn edge of the ledger. "Your mother," he said, "picked a good deal better than I ever once managed to." He closed the ledger there, for good. Set it down easy on his lap. Watched the fine dust rise up gold in the very last of the light, as the older children went running, laughing, clean through the yard below, and the cattle called low and steady from the near pasture beyond the fence, the whole ranch larger now, and steadier now too, by far, than it had ever once managed to be under his own single hand alone. Because some debts, he had slowly come to properly understand by then, over all those long years, were never truly meant to be paid off in plain dollars at all, not in the end. And the debts, that mattered the very most of all, in a whole lifetime, the ones written not into any banker's careful ledger, but instead into a father's own slow, hard-won respect for a daughter, who had once refused, flatly, to ever be treated as anyone's simple line item, those were the only true kind of real wealth this particular land had ever actually needed to properly hold, from the very beginning.